Hello everyone and future self. I learned a lot of hard lessons this last weekend on lots of things that can go wrong when you convert stuff to Web3D. So I want to document them for everybody, including myself, to save everyone time in the future when they run across such things. Hopefully this quick little guide will have the solutions that everybody needs for the symptoms that you're seeing. So each of these objects is the same object. Some of them are modified a little bit, and then I put a spotlight in the middle. And then spotlight is important because you're going to see the difference between importing things that accept lights, things that do not, even though we're going to have them included in the GLTF in both. Right off the bat, I want everybody to understand that if you're going to go through any of this stuff, I highly recommend getting simpleBake. You can learn how to do the baking without simpleBake, and simpleBake, understanding it is a little complex, I'll admit that, but it's so much nicer than not using it at all. The baking in Blender is kind of a pain in the ass and absolutely necessary for some of the stuff we need to do, and you'll see why. Pay attention to this plain texture when we start importing it into the web, because this plain texture, I didn't do anything to it. I'm leaving it alone. I'm going to show you the shader for it. It's a rather complex shader from Extreme PBR, and they've got nested node groups in order to build these shaders. That's what this plain texture is, and so we'll see what happens when you just don't mess with it at all. A PBR texture, let me explain real quick, is a physical based render. That is when we've got principled BSDF. We take that principled BSDF and we load in as many textures as we can that the material will allow, or that the material needs. And here you can see we've got all the textures possible baked for a material. These are all the possible things that you can bring in. I think it's actually a couple more than you're allowed to bring in, but all the things that you could bake into a principled BSDF for physical based rendering. Most of this will come over into the Web3D conversion. So this one is just going to serve as an example, but the reason I listed it like I did, the reason I called it PBR instead of principled BSDF, is because when you go to do baking, you have the option of doing these two bakes. You've got the PBR bake and you've got the cycles bake. We're going to go over what each one is and how to know when to use each. But that is an example. This one is an example of the PBR bake. All it does, it takes a procedural texture or a procedural material, and it takes all those textures that are behind. It's like got a principled BSDF, and it's got a bunch of textures, and it finds all those textures and it just connects them up directly. It'll do some baking for you, but it just tries to load as many textures as it can to replace all of the large chains of nodes that you've got, shader nodes. In this example, we've got UVs that are bigger, that basically go off the canvas of a texture. So I'll show you what that looks like. I've got a texture here, and you can see the texture size. Then I've got UVs for this texture that are all over the place and definitely go beyond. So not all the UVs fit on the texture. That is a problem, and you'll see why. Next, we've got no UV. So just in Blender alone, I'm going to switch to here. When you have no UVs, it just does whatever it wants. It looks like crap. So the first tip that I'm going to tell everybody is UV everything. If it has a texture, make a UV. Don't rely on Blender to figure out what your UVs need to look like. Start with a basic set of UVs, which is super fast to do, and then update any of the UVs that you need to. We have an emissive texture. So an emissive texture, this is going to, it pretty much applies to cycles. If you've got a cycles bake that's baked in your shadows and your highlights and all that kind of stuff, because especially you cannot bring in your own lights. Let's say no lighting is allowed to be imported. You're going to want to do this emissive texture, and that's because it's consistently going to have the same brights and the same darks, because it's going to emit that exact combo in your scene, no matter what the lighting looks like. The time you don't want to use it is when you want dynamic lighting to happen. And you also don't want to use it when you want reflections. If you need reflections, then you're going to use the PBR or principled bsdf. So that's the emission shader. Let's show what it looks like real quick. It's super simple. We've got one texture. It goes to the emission, has an emission strength for everything that's in the texture. The end. So just so you know where you get this thing, you can always create it yourself, but when you see cycles or PBR, well, primarily when you see cycles bake or cycles in simpleBake, if you come down to other settings under material, there's an emission material and a principled BS material, and you've now seen both. This was the emission material. Next up is normals. We've got an example here where the normals are just screwed up. And it's going to cause these weird things with the bake. You go to bake your texture and your lights and shadows and stuff into your model, and you say, what the heck is happening? Why are some of these things black? I've got all my UVs set up correctly. And you might have your UVs set up correctly. These normals are really difficult to find the issue unless you come in here and you set up the viewport overlay for face orientation. And everything that's red is going to have the wrong face orientation. A quick way to handle that is you're going to just go to tab into it, select everything, mesh, normals, recalculate outside, and that's going to handle it. I didn't even know this plane was flipped, but we can handle that right now. I'm going to select it, and I can just select the individual face if I want to, mesh, normals, flip. But you can see I've got some future examples here that could be, you could get a hint from it if you actually loaded up the face orientation. Geo. If you've got a bunch of missing, or if you've got crossed faces and missing faces and split edges and stuff like that, it's going to do some weird things. And you might not notice, it might not be as obvious as it is right here in Blender at the moment. And the number one tip I've got for this to just see if there's got any issues is there's something called the 3D print toolbox that comes with Blender, and you can have it check and it'll tell you how many possible issues you've got. You can do a quick make manifold and see if it'll fix it. Half the time it does some weird stuff with it, but I recommend you just you tab into the object, and you can have it highlight the individual issues so that you can correct them. And then when you get close, you might be able to do the make manifold and it'll work. Until then, it's unlikely. Holes. This is an extreme example, but if you are missing some faces, it's going to be pretty difficult to get a good result on the web component of it. It's going to have a hard time figuring out what the inside and the outside are, and you could get some inconsistent results. Again, one of the better ways to see this is to do the face orientation. And you can see I'm seeing the insides. I don't want to see the insides. So I have some areas to fill. I can come in, select some edges, or select a loop, hit F, and have it fill. And if I did that enough times, I should close up the holes and then maybe do make manifold at the end, and it should find any that I could not. So here's cycles. Cycles is a good example of what a cycles bake is going to look like. It's got all the shadows and light baked in. So I can go into this mode. I'm going to remove the spotlight that's in it. And you can see that it still has that bright look to it. Everything still has this bright look to it. Even though I removed the spotlight, I'm going to remove this emissive thing too. And you can see the insides are still lit, just like the spotlight was still there. And this edge this entire face is still lit bright. and the outside is dark, I could turn off all other lights and a lot of this would still show like that. It's good for baking in shadows. Shadows are hard to do real time for performance reasons. Doing the baking from the cycles thing can take a lot of complexity and simulate it and just like set it in place for you to show with an emissive texture or even not with an emissive texture, as long as you've got enough lighting to see the result. And then we're back to PBR. So that pretty much covers all of the examples. Last, we've got the control in here, and that's just to show that, you know, if I did nothing, then it's going to, you know, what it's going to look like. This is the most basic of examples that has the texture hooked up. So I've got a principled bsdf, and I've got a diffuse texture with some coordinates. Now, one thing to keep in mind is you can use a principled bsdf to do emission. All you have to do is take one of the textures, it doesn't have to be diffuse, but typically the diffuse, and you're going to connect it to the emission. You can do emission with your principled bsdf. You can have more options. It can still have a lot of the options that are going to go with it. They're also going to be redundant because it's going to have a hard time doing some of these things while it's also emitting light. But the option is there. I have found that this can be useful on a number of things, including images as planes. It comes in as a principled bsdf, and I usually connect up the emission for it. So now that we've been over all of the examples, let's take a look at my tips. I'll leave you with set UVs for textures. That just means if you're going to use a texture as in an image, just make sure that you set some UVs. Make sure those UVs fit on the texture. Save before baking. I had my system crash many times, especially on my MacBook. I actually had zero problems when running on my gaming PC that has a RTX 3090 on it. But on my MacBook Pro, I either had to put really low settings or it would probably crash. Use emissive textures when you don't have lighting. Use PBR textures when you need reflections or you have good enough lighting. Check your normals and your geo. Test with an online viewer. I've shown, hopefully if I did the editing right, I showed an online viewer in these examples mixed in throughout. I will have the links for those in the description. If you use an online viewer, it is super fast to do your export, test it out, see what it's going to look like before you commit to it in a scene that you've got more programming built in for it. Just grab your GLB, drag it in there. You can just worry about messing around in Blender and seeing what it looks like in the web without doing too much else. One was able to import the lighting, and you can see each of the lights inside of the lanterns was brought in, and the other one has a environment map and no lighting. We can just reduce the exposure down to something reasonable. Then we can start to have an idea of what it really looks like. Simpler direct emissive materials that weren't just a bsdf emissive didn't come across in this one. So what's good about this one is it actually brought in the emissive textures with their emissive strength. That way you can actually see them no matter what the lighting is like. Don't have an extra texture. What that means is if you don't need a texture, don't include it. And also, if you don't need the entire texture size, then don't include the texture size that you don't need. And a lot of that is because the texture is going to get compressed at some process or some point. And if you include too much, then you're going to have a small portion of that compressed texture and it might look like crap. When you do a bake, it's only going to include the texture that you need. But if you have a repeating texture, then that it's fine to use that texture and let it automatically repeat. And then do not try to bake in the background. I tried this with simpleBake. I never got it to work. It's actually impressive that the developer tried to accomplish that. I'm sure it worked at some times or with some certain systems. I did not get it to work. If you've got a gaming PC or, a good graphics card, then the foreground bakes run very fast. So I have no complaints there. I'm fine with it running reliably in the foreground. We've been through that. Let's run through simpleBake really quick. I want to explain these options again. When you're using simpleBake, it's in the render menu. These first options, you're going to use a PBR Bake in order to simplify your shader material down to its textures just directly connected to a principled bsdf. And you're going to do a cycles bake when you want to actually let it render things for you and bake things like lights and shadows into your diffuse texture or something similar. Settings presets is just where you can save a bunch of stuff. You're going to have to specify which objects you want baked. That's pretty self-explanatory. When you do a cycles bake, you're just going to leave everything as combined until you know what you're doing, and then you could probably remove some of these things. PBR Bake, intentionally only check the boxes that you're going to use. Otherwise, you're going to have textures you don't need. If you know you've got no emission on the object that you're doing, don't bake an emission material or an emission map. Same thing with bumps or alphas or any of these things. If you don't need the texture, don't bake it for that object. Special bakes, you're going to do ambient light or ambient inclusion or light map if you know what those are and you want to include them, and they will show up later in the other settings. Texture settings, I didn't really mess with much here. Occasionally I would make sure that I had transparent background checked. Sometimes if I knew I needed larger textures, then I would increase their resolution here. UV settings, I usually left it alone, and that's because I made sure I had UVs on all my objects. There's no reason to go through the process of baking and then you're letting it randomly assign UVs. And then in other settings, these are pretty self-explanatory. It's, are you going to allow it to copy your objects, hide them, just bring the new object with the new material applied. I recommend that. Lastly, on this create GLTF settings, that's just for it to try to pass whether you baked a light map or ambient inclusion. It's going to try to pass those to a GLTF module that can accept those textures. And then you leave it on foreground and hit bake. That is the simpleBake walkthrough. As usual, thanks for joining, and if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up on Discord. I hope this has helped somebody in the future, maybe even myself, and saved them a bunch of time. See you guys next time.